The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people settled into their seats. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that made even the most confident attorneys straighten their ties and sit up a little taller. At the front of the room, behind the massive wooden bench, sat Judge Samuel Whitaker, known for his sharp tongue, strict rulings, and complete lack of patience. He was a man who commanded respect, or at the very least fear. He drummed his fingers on the bench, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom before landing on the defendant, a man sitting silently in a wheelchair near the defense table. Dressed in a tailored gray suit, his posture was upright, his expression unreadable. There was something about him, something that made a few people glance his way more than once, as if trying to place him. Judge Whitaker barely hid his smirk as he leaned forward, tapping the gavel lightly. "Let's get on with it. We don't have all day," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "Defendant, state your full name for the record." The man in the wheelchair remained silent for a moment before speaking. His voice was smooth, controlled. "David Carter." The judge's smirk deepened. "Mr. Carter, I don't know what kind of stunt you think you're pulling here, but let's be clear. This courtroom isn't the place for theatrics." He waved a hand dismissively. "You're here to answer for your actions, not to waste our time." A few chuckles rippled through the spectators. A couple of attorneys exchanged glances. It was no secret that Judge Whitaker had a habit of looking down on people he deemed unworthy of his respect. And right now, it was clear he saw David Carter as nothing more than another case to rush through, another person beneath his notice. But what no one realized, least of all the judge, was that David Carter wasn't just any defendant. He remained calm, his hands resting lightly on the arms of his wheelchair. He didn't flinch at the judge's tone, didn't react to the quiet laughter from the onlookers. He simply waited, as if knowing something they didn't. The prosecutor stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, given the circumstances, I believe it would be beneficial for Mr. Carter to provide some background information before we proceed." Judge Whitaker scoffed. "Background information? This is a courtroom, not a storytelling competition. If Mr. Carter has something to say, he can say it when I ask him to." David met the judge's eyes, steady and unwavering. "I was under the impression that a fair trial included the chance to be heard," he said, his voice even. The room fell silent. The judge bristled, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged so directly. His fingers tightened around the gavel. "Watch yourself, Mr. Carter. I run this courtroom, and I decide who speaks and when." David nodded, as if filing that information away. "Noted." A tense pause followed. The energy in the room shifted slightly. Nothing obvious, just an undercurrent of something unspoken. It was as if everyone sensed that something about this case wasn't quite what it seemed. The judge sighed dramatically. "Fine. If it'll move things along, enlighten us, Mr. Carter. Who exactly do you think you are?" That was the moment everything changed. David leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, deliberately, he placed his hands on the arms of his wheelchair, and before anyone could react, he pushed himself up. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Whitaker's smirk vanished instantly. His face paled as he stared at the man standing before him, now towering over the defense table. His jaw tightened, his eyes darting around, as if searching for some logical explanation. David Carter adjusted his suit jacket, the confidence in his posture undeniable. He let the silence stretch, watching the judge's reaction. Then with a calm, knowing look, he spoke again, this time revealing the truth that would leave the entire courtroom in shock. And in that moment, Judge Whitaker finally understood. He had made a grave mistake. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The judge's grip on his gavel tightened as he tried to process what had just happened. The man he had spent the last several minutes belittling had just stood up from his wheelchair with an air of quiet authority, leaving everyone in the room stunned. David adjusted his cuffs, his movements slow and deliberate. His expression remained calm, but there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The once smug judge now looked visibly uncomfortable, as if he had just realized that he was no longer in control of the situation. The murmurs among the spectators grew louder. People whispered to one another, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Even the prosecutor seemed momentarily frozen, flipping through the case file as if some explanation might suddenly appear on the pages. Judge Whittaker's expression changed instantly. The color drained from his face, and his hands twitched as he adjusted his robe. What is the meaning of this?" he stammered, his voice suddenly lacking the confidence it had carried moments ago. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a badge, holding it up for everyone to see. "My name is Agent Lucas Monroe, Department of Justice." His voice was steady, controlled. "And this hearing is over." A ripple of shock spread through the room. Even the officers holding David hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Amelia's lips curled into a knowing smile. "You're late," she said, folding her arms. Monroe didn't return the smile. He turned his attention back to the judge. "Judge Whittaker, you are hereby under federal investigation for abuse of power, judicial misconduct, and obstruction of justice." The judge let out a strained laugh, though it was clear he was anything but amused. "This is absurd," he scoffed. "You have no jurisdiction in my courtroom." Monroe didn't flinch. "Your courtroom?" He took a slow step forward. "You seem to be under the impression that you are above the law." He glanced at the officers still holding David. "Release him. Now." The officers hesitated, looking between the judge and Monroe. "I said now." Finally, the officers let go, stepping back. David rolled his shoulders, but his eyes never left the judge. He was watching closely, taking in every flicker of emotion that crossed Whittaker's face. The judge wasn't just angry, he was afraid. "This is an outrage," Whittaker spat, his voice rising. "This man," he pointed at David, "is a fraud. He came into my courtroom under false pretenses." Monroe didn't blink. "You mean he exposed the truth?" His tone remained even, but the weight behind his words was unmistakable. The judge opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He was scrambling for control, trying to find a way out. But there wasn't one. Not this time. Amelia stepped forward. "You should have just let the trial play out," she said, shaking her head. "But you got desperate, and desperate men make mistakes." The room was deathly silent now. Every person in that courtroom was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, in a move no one expected, Judge Whittaker slammed his gavel down and stood. "This hearing is adjourned," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. He turned to leave, his robe billowing behind him as he made for the exit. But he didn't get far. As soon as he reached the doors, another set of officers stepped inside, blocking his path. Unlike the previous ones, these weren't just court security. They wore federal badges. They had been waiting. The judge froze, his entire body going rigid. "Judge Whittaker," Monroe said, stepping forward. "You are officially under investigation. You will remain here for questioning." For the first time since David had entered this courtroom, the judge had nothing to say. Judge Whittaker stood frozen at the exit, his face pale as the federal officers blocked his way. His breathing was shallow, his eyes darting across the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The power he had clung to for years was slipping away, and for the first time, he had no control over what happened next. Agent Monroe stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, you need to come with us." Whittaker clenched his jaw, shaking his head. "You have no right." "The evidence says otherwise," Monroe interrupted. "Your attempts to silence Mr. Carter, your misconduct in multiple cases, and your direct interference in justice proceedings have been documented. We have witness statements. We have recordings." He let that last part hang in the air, watching as the judge's expression twisted into something between anger and panic. David watched carefully, his pulse steady now. He had waited for this moment, not for revenge, but for justice. He had known Whittaker was corrupt, but he hadn't realized just how deep it ran until today. The judge had been willing to destroy anyone who threatened his position, but now he was the one trapped. Amelia glanced at David, giving him a small nod. They had done what they came to do. But something still didn't sit right with her. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now they were screaming at her that there was one last piece of this puzzle left to uncover. Whittaker's hands curled into fists, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths. Then, in a move no one expected, he turned toward David, his eyes burning with something darker than just desperation. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You think you've won. You have no idea what you've stepped into." David didn't flinch. "I think you're out of moves." David remained seated now, his expression composed, though there was an unmistakable sharpness in his gaze. He had planned for this moment, prepared for every possible reaction, but even he could sense the underlying unpredictability in the room. He knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about the case in front of them. This was about exposing something much bigger. The tension in the air grew heavier when the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A woman in a navy blue suit stepped inside, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she moved toward the defense table. She carried herself with quiet authority, and as soon as she appeared, the prosecutor straightened in his seat, his fingers twitching nervously. David didn't need to turn around to know who she was. Amelia Grant, federal investigator, known for her relentless pursuit of corruption within the justice system. Her presence alone sent a wave of unease through the courtroom. Judge Whittaker shifted in his seat, clearly recognizing her as well. His voice, when he finally spoke, was clipped. "Miss Grant, this is a private hearing. What exactly is your business here?" Amelia stopped just a few feet from David's table, her expression unreadable. "Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "I'm here because there have been multiple complaints regarding the handling of cases in this courtroom. I was in the area and thought it best to observe." The judge's jaw tightened. "Observe?" he echoed, his tone defensive. She nodded. "Yes, and from what I've seen so far, I'd say the concerns raised were not unfounded." A few quiet gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even the bailiff, who had stood motionless for most of the trial, glanced at the judge with barely hidden curiosity. David remained still, watching the exchange closely. This wasn't part of his original plan, but he welcomed it. The more eyes on this case, the better. Judge Whittaker took a slow breath, visibly trying to rein in his frustration. "Miss Grant," he said, forcing a tight-lipped smile, "if you have concerns about my courtroom, I suggest you file them through the proper channels. Right now, we have a case to proceed with." Amelia didn't look convinced. She turned slightly, meeting David's gaze for the first time. "Would you be open to answering a few questions after today's hearing, Mr. Carter?" David held her gaze and gave a small nod. "Of course." The judge's fingers curled into a fist against his desk. He was losing control, and he knew it. "Enough of this," he snapped, his voice sharper now. Let's return to the matter at hand. He turned his gaze back to David, trying to regain his authority. Mr. Carter, since you seem so intent on making a spectacle of my courtroom, why don't you go ahead and explain why exactly you're here today? David leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. He had been waiting for this moment. I was brought into this courtroom under the assumption that I was a defendant, he said. However, that's not the full truth. A ripple of confusion passed through the spectators. Even the prosecutor stiffened, looking at David now with something closer to alarm. The judge narrowed his eyes. Then what exactly is the truth? David let the silence stretch before answering. I'm here as a witness. A stunned pause followed. The judge's reaction was instant. He looked at the prosecutor, his expression demanding answers. The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly caught off guard. David continued. There is an ongoing investigation into judicial misconduct in this court. I was sent in to gather first-hand experience, to see if the claims held any weight. I was given no special treatment, no advance notice. Just the same treatment any other defendant would receive. His words hung in the air like a heavy weight. The judge's face darkened, his jaw tightening. This is absurd, he spat. You mean to tell me this entire case, this entire proceeding, was nothing more than a setup? David shook his head. Not a setup, Your Honor. A test. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. The judge's grip on the gavel was so tight his knuckles had turned white. He looked toward the prosecutor, but the man was visibly shaken now, avoiding eye contact. Amelia folded her arms, watching the exchange with a neutral expression. If that's the case, she said, then I believe we need to review how this courtroom has been operating. Judge Whittaker's face flushed. He had spent years controlling this courtroom, running it the way he saw fit. And now, in a matter of minutes, it felt as though everything was slipping away from him. David sat back in his chair, knowing full well that the battle wasn't over yet. But he had done what he came to do. He had cracked the foundation. Now it was only a matter of time before the rest of the truth came to light. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Judge Whittaker's face was red with barely contained anger. His grip still tight on the gavel, as if he wanted to slam it down and end everything right then and there. But he couldn't. Not with the entire room watching. Not with Amelia Grant standing there, eyes sharp, taking in every reaction, every hesitation. The power that he was so used to wielding seemed to be slipping right through his fingers. And for the first time, there was uncertainty in his expression. David remained seated, calm, but his heart pounded in his chest. He knew he had pushed the judge into a corner, and cornered men were dangerous. He had expected resistance, but now he could see the panic settling in behind the judge's eyes. This wasn't just about arrogance anymore. There was something more at play here, something deeper. He could feel it. The prosecutor, still struggling to process what had just happened, cleared his throat. Your Honor, given these unexpected revelations, I believe we should adjourn and reconsider the circumstances of this case. His voice was uneasy, and for the first time, he didn't sound confident in his own words. Judge Whittaker turned to him sharply. No, the word came out fast, too fast, like an instinctive reaction. He caught himself, then took a breath, attempting to regain his composure. No, he repeated, his voice more measured this time. We will see this through. Amelia raised an eyebrow. See what through exactly? The judge didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered between her and David, calculating. He was trying to find a way out, a way to regain control before it was too late. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on everyone. David could feel the shift happening. He had seen this look before, the moment someone realized they were losing, that the truth was unraveling faster than they could contain it. But he also knew that desperate men were capable of desperate moves. Then the unexpected happened. The doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly opened again, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. They moved with purpose, their expressions unreadable, as they walked straight toward David. He tensed, but he didn't react, not yet. He needed to see where this was going. Judge Whitaker leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, due to the nature of these revelations and the disruption you have caused, I find it necessary to take immediate action." His voice was steadier now, more assured, as if he had just found his lifeline. "Bailiff, have him taken into custody." A murmur of shock spread through the room. Even Amelia looked momentarily caught off guard before her expression hardened. "You can't be serious." "I am," the judge said, his grip on control tightening again. "This man has admitted to deceiving the court, interfering with proceedings, and attempting to undermine this institution. That cannot be ignored." The officers reached David's side, but he didn't move. He wasn't going to fight. He didn't need to. He looked up at the judge, meeting his gaze, unflinching. "You're making a mistake." Judge Whitaker smirked slightly, as if he had won. "I don't think so." Amelia took a step forward, her voice sharp. "If you go through with this, you're only proving the very point we came here to make." The judge barely spared her a glance. "That's enough, Miss Grant." He gestured to the officers. "Take him." David finally stood, his movements slow and deliberate. The entire courtroom was still watching, waiting to see what he would do. He could feel the tension crackling in the air. He had expected pushback, but this was bold, even for Whitaker. This wasn't just about silencing him. This was about making an example out of him. As the officers took hold of his arms, David exhaled slowly. This wasn't over. Not even close. In fact, it was just getting started. David felt the cold grip of the officers on his arms, but he didn't resist. He let them take him, his expression calm, even as the judge smirked from the bench. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. No one had expected this. Even Amelia, who had seen her fair share of corruption, looked momentarily stunned. But David wasn't surprised. He knew that people like Judge Whitaker would do whatever it took to keep their grip on power. As the officers led him toward the side door, something unexpected happened. The courtroom doors swung open once more, but this time it wasn't another officer or court clerk. A tall man in a gray suit stepped inside, his presence commanding instant attention. The murmurs in the courtroom died down, replaced by a thick silence. The man's sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on the judge. Judge Whitaker's expression changed instantly. The color drained from his face, and his hands twitched as he adjusted his robe. What is the meaning of this?" He stammered, his voice suddenly lacking the confidence Judge Whitaker finally found his voice, though it wasn't nearly as strong as before. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, though his tone lacked its usual confidence. David met his gaze with steady eyes. "I believe I was asked to explain who I am," he said simply. The prosecutor cleared his throat, his fingers fumbling with the papers in front of him. "Your Honor, I believe there may have been a misunderstanding regarding Mr. Carter's identity." The judge's eyes narrowed. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, though the hesitation in his voice was obvious. David let out a small breath, then finally spoke with measured calm. "My name is Dr. David Carter. Former military, graduate of Harvard Law, and currently an investigative attorney specializing in exposing corruption within the justice system." A collective gasp swept through the room. Even some of the jurors who had been sitting quietly up until now, exchanged stunned glances. Judge Whittaker's face drained of color. His lips pressed into a tight line, but he said nothing. David continued, his voice smooth and unwavering. I have spent the last year investigating claims of judicial misconduct and bias in this very courtroom. I've sat in on cases, reviewed transcripts, and spoken to people affected by rulings that seemed questionable at best. His gaze didn't waver as he added, "And now I'm here." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog. The murmurs died down, replaced by an eerie stillness. Everyone was waiting to see how the judge would respond, waiting to understand how this situation had flipped so suddenly. Judge Whittaker forced a laugh, though it was weak. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed, but there was no mistaking the nervous edge in his voice. "Some kind of stunt to make a mockery of my courtroom." David didn't flinch. "No stunt, Your Honor," he said. "Just the truth." The judge clenched his jaw, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He reached for his gavel as if holding onto it would somehow regain his authority. "Then why the wheelchair?" he snapped. David's expression didn't change. "Because I wanted to see how I would be treated. To see if the rumors about your courtroom were true." He let his words hang in the air before adding, "And you didn't disappoint." The weight of the statement landed hard. The spectators, the attorneys, even the courtroom staff, everyone seemed to hold their breath. The judge's hands tightened around the gavel. His mind was working, scrambling for a way to regain control, but nothing came to him. The arrogance he had carried so easily just moments ago had disappeared. David finally moved away from the defense table, walking toward the center of the courtroom with an air of quiet confidence. "You see, Your Honor, this isn't just about me. This is about every person who has stood in this courtroom and wondered whether they'd be given a fair chance." He glanced toward the audience, his gaze sweeping over the people watching him. "I may be the one standing here today, but I'm not the first person you've looked down on, and I certainly won't be the last." A murmur of agreement rippled through the spectators. A few people nodded. Others exchanged knowing looks. Judge Whittaker's face darkened. His fingers tapped the desk, a sign of his growing frustration. "I will not allow my courtroom to be turned into a spectacle," he said sharply. David tilted his head slightly. "A spectacle," he repeated. "Or accountability." The judge stiffened. David let the silence stretch, then slowly turned back toward his seat. He sat down, not because he had to, but because he chose to. And in that moment, it became clear that he was the one in control now. The prosecutor cleared his throat again, shifting nervously. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "I think it might be best if we take a short recess before proceeding." Judge Whittaker's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, he looked as though he was considering the consequences of his words, the weight of the eyes watching him. The courtroom remained tense, waiting for his next move. But one thing was certain, nothing was going to be the same after this. The judge's gavel hovered in the air, his knuckles white as he hesitated. He had never been challenged like this before, not in his own courtroom, not by someone who seemed to know exactly what he was doing. His eyes darted toward the prosecutor, who was still shuffling through papers, clearly trying to buy himself time. The spectators sat in an almost eerie silence, waiting for what would happen next. The judge let out a short, bitter laugh. "You really believe that? You think I did all of this alone?" He smirked, but it was laced with something unnerving. "You should be asking yourself who allowed me to get away with this for so long." The courtroom felt colder now. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything else that had been said. Monroe's expression hardened. "We'll find out." Whittaker's smirk didn't fade as the federal officers stepped forward, placing him in handcuffs. The click of the metal echoed through the silent room. Even as he was led away, there was something unsettling about the way he carried himself, not like a man who had lost, but like someone who knew something no one else did. David watched him disappear through the courtroom doors, but his mind was already racing. There was more to this. There had to be. People like Whitaker didn't rise to power alone, and they certainly didn't stay there without help. If what he said was true, then this was far from over. Amelia sighed, running a hand through her hair. "You heard that, right?" David nodded. "Yeah." She exhaled sharply. "I hate loose ends." David turned to her, his expression serious. "Then let's find out who's really pulling the strings." The tension in the room hadn't eased. It had only shifted. Justice had been served today, but it was clear this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something bigger, something buried even deeper than they had realized. As the remaining courtroom spectators filed out, whispering among themselves, David and Amelia exchanged a knowing look. They had won the battle, but the war, that was still waiting for them. The courtroom slowly emptied, but David remained seated, his mind still processing everything that had just happened. Judge Whitaker was gone, but his final words lingered like a warning, a shadow stretching beyond the walls of justice. Amelia stood beside him, arms crossed, staring at the doors as if expecting someone else to walk in with more bad news. "You really think he had people covering for him?" she finally asked. David exhaled, rubbing his temples. People like him don't act alone. They don't get away with corruption for years without protection. Monroe returned from speaking with his team, adjusting his suit as he approached them. "We're going to dig deeper," he said. Whitaker didn't just abuse his power. He built a system that worked in his favor. We've already started connecting the dots. David nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. He had spent years fighting for people who had been wronged by the very system that was supposed to protect them. He had seen firsthand how difficult it was to dismantle corruption, how power had a way of protecting itself. He wasn't naive enough to think this was over. Amelia nudged him lightly. "You okay?" He looked at her and managed a small smile. "I think so." She arched a brow. "You don't sound convinced." David let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "It's just, people like Whitaker, they don't go down easy. And if he was right, if he was just a piece of something bigger, then we take them down too," she said firmly. Monroe checked his watch. "We'll keep you updated as the case develops. But for now, you should take a moment to breathe. You did something big today." David nodded but said nothing. He had never done this for recognition. He had done it because it was right, because people deserved justice, because too many voices had been ignored for too long. And even though today was a victory, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like the start of another fight. As they stepped outside, the air felt cooler, fresher, as if the weight of corruption had lifted just a little. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters, their cameras flashing, microphones stretching toward them. "Mr. Carter, what's your response to Judge Whitaker's arrest?"